also look at a hospital from its governance structure. So what we see at the top normally is a setup like your board of directors or your board of trustees, and they have the main responsibility of the system at large. Under your board of directors, what we'll see is your administration, and this is where we'll find our C-suite. So we see positions like your CEO, your chief executive officer, your CFO, your chief financial officer, your COO, your chief operating officer, and your CNO, your chief nursing officer, will be right here in the C-suite in the administration range. Now, under administration, we'll have four main categories, generally what we see across all hospitals. We'll see informational services, we'll see therapeutic services, we'll see diagnostic services, and we'll see support services. Now, under each one of those buckets, we'll have our departments that are listed out. So under informational systems, you may have something like admissions, you may have information systems, medical records, human resources. Under therapeutic services, you may have physical therapy, occupational therapy, you may have dietary here, you may have nursing. Under diagnostic services, we'll find departments like emergency medicine, cardiology, medical lab, imaging, and then under support services will be our departments like central supply, maintenance, environmental services, housekeeping, and transport. Now, why is it important to understand organizational structure of a hospital? Well, your understanding of how the organizational chart works really helps to facilitate how well you understand the hospital's chain of command and how you work through the chain of command. If there's a reporting issue, you don't always go straight to the CEO or you don't always go straight to the board of directors. You have to work up through your chain of command. The org chart is also going to show which individual or department is accountable for which area of the hospital. So you have some level of accountability and visibility brought through by understanding and being able to interpret an organizational chart. And the complexity of our organizational structure really depends on the size of our healthcare facility. So if we have a large acute care hospital, it's going to have more than likely a very complicated structure because it's going to have lots of different departments, lots of people who report, where a smaller hospital or smaller institution may have a much simpler organizational chart. Three main roles that we want to make sure to look at within our governance structure are your CEO, your board of directors, and your chief of medical staff. So your CEO, your chief executive officer, is in your C-suite. They are the person who is in charge primarily of the hospital. They look at the day-to-day operations, and they are at the top of the leadership for the hospital structure. Now, we have our board of directors, or sometimes called board of trustees, and the people who serve on the board of directors are legally responsible for the actions of the hospital. So they work a lot with strategic planning and they work with budgeting, giving their final approval. And just recalling that they are beholden to the legal actions of the hospital and the actions that it takes as a healthcare facility. And then the final position, your chief of medical staff, is in charge of and oversees medical staff and your physicians. So they work to be more of that liaison when any medical or physician-related issues emerge. The last way we can look at the hospital structure is by its licensure, certification, or accreditation. So when we look at the licensure of a hospital, this is something that comes down from the individual state governments, and each state sets their own standards. So there's no one universal standard across the country. Each state has their own standards that they've set. But licensure oversees healthcare facilities in terms of building codes. They look at sanitation, they look at equipment, and they look at licensure of the personnel that work within that healthcare facility. Now, facilities can be licensed but not accredited, and that does happen. We do have some facilities that have received licensure from the state, but they have not received any type of accreditation. So speaking of accreditation, accreditation is another way we can look at a hospital. Accreditation is more of your private standards that are developed by different organizations to meet different criteria and standards and best practices of care. So let's say a local healthcare facility has a clinical and pastoral education program, they can go out and receive accreditation through the Association of Clinical and Pastoral Care. Or if we have a facility that is a women's center, a breast cancer center, they give potentially life-saving mammograms, and they can be accredited by the American College of Radiology. So different types of organizations can offer different types of accreditation. Now, one that hopefully most of you are familiar with, or if you're not, you will be soon, one accrediting body is called the Joint Commission. They go in to survey hospitals and make sure that they meet standards set by Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Because they do have deeming authority or deeming status, they can go in on behalf of Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and do this survey. So if a hospital takes this route, then they are fine with accreditation, and they don't need to worry about seeking certification, which is the last way we can look at a hospital structure. Certification comes into play if you, as a hospital system or a facility, have a need for Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement. So we look at, through certification, we look at conditions of participation, particularly around patient health and safety. But again, if you're a hospital system and you have a Joint Commission accreditation, you don't need to go after certification. But if you decide not to go after a Joint Commission, you will have to obtain some type of certification if you do want to receive Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement. So a couple key points to pick up on, particularly with inpatient facilities. Just remember that those are types of facilities that require some type of overnight stay. You don't just come in, receive your treatment, and leave within the same day. There is an overnight component there. And our most common types of inpatient facilities are going to be our hospitals and our nursing homes. Both have some type of inpatient stay or overnight stay tied to them. Also recall some different ways that government policy has been triggered in terms of expansion and contraction of the amount of hospitals that we've seen across the country and through our history in healthcare and our history as a hospital system overall. So we see the Hill-Burton Act come out that put a lot of money into the system in terms of infrastructure, with the thought being that if we build a lot of hospitals, we'll be able to open up a lot of access to healthcare. And then around the 1980s, we had a change in our reimbursement to prospective payment and managed care organizations, which worked in the sense that its goal was to cut costs, but by doing so, many of our hospitals had to close. So we saw a huge expansion at one point in time in our history of hospitals, and then a huge contraction of hospitals, with a lot of hospitals closing around the 1980s. The final thing to pick up on, or the final key point for this module, is just to realize and understand that the majority of hospitals in the United States are private, non-for-profit community hospitals, and we saw the distribution of how those are distributed across the country.